What would you call it if your people were expelled from their homeland at gunpoint and never allowed to return? Ethnic cleansing? A crime against humanity. We, the Palestinian people, call it the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. How else can you describe what happened to us over 75 years ago? Over the course of 1948, Zionist militias drove more than 750,000 Palestinians beyond the borders of Palestine. Most ended up in refugee camps in neighboring countries. In all, about 3/4 of all Palestinians were deprived of their homes, their land, their livelihoods, and in some cases, their lives. David Ben-Gurion, the man who would become Israel's first prime minister, laid out a plan for what he called the compulsory transfer of the indigenous Palestinian population. That entailed wiping over 450 Palestinian villages and towns from the map. Communities, histories, and cultures torn apart. In that process, whole villages were massacred, like those of Deir Yassin and Tantura. We still find mass graves, the evidence of those inhumane crimes to this day. This year is the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, which we commemorate on the 15th of May. But the Nakba didn't end in 1948. It continues to this day as a process of settler colonialism and apartheid. This video tells the story of how it happened, how it continues, and how we, the Palestinian people and our allies all over the world, struggle for freedom, dignity, and justice. Our brutalization and dispossession is as a result of the creation of the State of Israel, whose roots stretch back to the late 19th century Europe. Europe's Jews faced systematic anti-Semitism, legal discrimination, and violent pogroms. They came up with a huge range of attempted solutions, from religious separatism to liberal assimilation to communism to Bundism. One strand that emerged was called Zionism. It sought to create a Jewish national home in Palestine through settler colonization. To justify this colonization, they promoted the narrative that the country was nothing but a desert, waiting to be inhabited and cultivated. It's a narrative that we still hear today through figures like President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who recently commended Israel for making the desert bloom.
Today, we celebrate 75 years of vibrant democracy in the heart of the Middle East. You have literally made the desert bloom.
But this is simply not true. Before the Zionist colonization of Palestine, the land was already inhabited and cultivated by the Palestinian people. For the Zionist movement, the fact that Palestinian Jews, Christians, and Muslims already lived side by side in relative peace for centuries was dismissed as a minor stumbling block that could be overcome. One of the fathers of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, said that they would simply force the penniless native population across the frontier. The Zionist founding fathers did not hide the fact that they were seeking to replace the indigenous Palestinian population to build an ethnically Jewish state. The early Zionists established a foothold in Palestine by buying up land from wealthy landowners and organizing Jewish migration. But it would take the firepower of European imperialism for that process to accelerate. Until the First World War, Britain's imperial strategy in the Middle East was anchored by the Ottoman Empire. In the eyes of British leaders, Ottoman rule was preferable to a European scramble for the Middle East, which could sever Britain's land route to India and limit its access to the Suez Canal. When World War I erupted and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, Britain began to chart a new course for its imperial policy in the region. It would find an instrument of that policy in the Zionist movement. In 1917, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, issued a public statement in which Britain declared its sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations and offered its support for what it called a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This statement, known today as the Balfour Declaration, laid the ground for what was to come. Later that year, British troops took Jerusalem and occupied Palestine from the Ottomans. By declaring itself the guarantor of the project of Jewish statehood, Britain was able to justify its occupation of Palestine and maintain its foothold in the wider region. British imperial patronage was invaluable to the Zionist movement. With the help of the British authorities, the Zionist movement was able to accelerate the migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. Indeed, over 30 years of British rule saw the European Jewish population in Palestine increase over tenfold to just under 1/3 of the total population. The British also protected Zionism from Palestinian opposition, enabling the formation of Zionist militias and infrastructure while systematically disarming the Palestinian resistance and weakening Palestinian society. In this way, British imperialism and Zionism worked hand in glove to expel the indigenous Palestinian population from their homes. But Palestinian opposition to these twin projects would soon test their fragile alliance. In 1936, the Palestinian people rose up against both British and Zionist colonialism in an uprising known as the Great Revolt that would last 3 years. Despite the bravery of the Palestinian resistance, the British crushed the uprising and dismantled the Palestinian revolutionary movement, imprisoning and killing its leadership. Meanwhile, in a move that enraged the Zionist movement, the British also began to limit Jewish European immigration to the country. In doing so, they hoped to protect their imperial dominance and bring about stability to their rule. In response, the Zionists formed clandestine armed militias and began their assault against both the Palestinian people and the British occupiers. In 1947, Britain, with its imperial reach severely limited by the Second World War, abruptly announced that it would end its mandate in Palestine.
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
Now, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people accelerated. The Zionist forces, armed with tanks and equipment left behind by the British, took more than 78% of historic Palestine, ethnically cleansed and destroyed over 450 villages and cities, and massacred some 15,000 Palestinians. The Palestinian resistance not only had limited resources, but it had also been systematically immobilized since the Great Revolt. Palestinian intellectual Fayez Sayegh wrote in his seminal work, Zionist Colonialism in Palestine, the Arab people of Palestine lost not only the battle for the political control of its own country, it lost its country as well. In 1948, the Zionist movement declared the independence of their new Jewish state, the State of Israel. In response, the surrounding Arab nations declared war. They wanted to liberate Palestine from this new colonial occupation. But the Zionist state was prepared. Armed by Western powers, Israel defeated the Arab states and deepened its foothold in the region. The strategy outlined by Herzl at the turn of the century would now be brought to life. Since 1948, the Palestinian people have lost more than 85% of their land to an ongoing process of expansion and settler colonialism. Today, more than half the Palestinian people live in permanent exile. And Palestinians both in exile and Palestine are condemned to live in conditions of profound indignity. Gaza, reduced to an open-air prison and under permanent Israeli siege, has long been deemed unlivable by the UN. 1 in 2 residents live in poverty, and 1 in 3 in deep poverty. Infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, is routinely destroyed by the Israeli bombardment. Meanwhile, last year was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank for over 2 decades, and 1/4 of the fatalities were children. Across Palestine, the Palestinian people are routinely incarcerated, with estimates suggesting that over 800,000 Palestinians have been in Israeli prisons since 1967. The Israeli regime also uses the Palestinian people as test subjects for new technologies of war, which they export all around the world to oppressive regimes. Technologies that poison Palestinian bodies and land, and that keep Palestinian communities constantly surveilled. Legalized land expropriation, forced evictions, and mass demolitions of homes of Palestinians in Jerusalem, Masafer Yatta, and the Nakba Desert are accompanied by intimidation and harassment by the Israeli army and settlers, making life for the Palestinian people unbearable. State-backed settler violence has intensified with attacks like the recent fascist pogrom in the Palestinian town of Hawari, occurring with increasing regularity and with absolute impunity. Echoing the policies of erasure pursued by the early architects of Zionism, the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said that Hawari needs to be erased and that the state should be the one to do that. When we Palestinians talk of the Nakba, we are not simply talking about historical injustice, but a brutal reality faced by Palestinians every day and a continuous process of settler colonial erasure. Could the Nakba finally come to an end? In the past few years, Palestinian resistance against Israeli oppression and settler colonialism has grown in strength and organization, mobilizing to defend the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, international human rights organizations, taking lead from Palestinian civil society, have recognized Israel as an apartheid state. The Palestinian BDS movement, which calls on peoples around the world to challenge state, corporate, and institutional complicity with the apartheid regime, grows in strength every day. And the United Nations General Assembly recently commemorated the Nakba on its 75th anniversary, a historic first that was met with some indignation within the Israeli regime. These developments accompany major shifts in global politics, the decline of American hegemony, a renewed impetus towards non-alignment, and a sharpened focus on the realities of imperialism and colonialism for large parts of the world's population. Palestine sits at the heart of these shifts. As the Palestinian writer and revolutionary Ghassan Kanafani reminds us, the Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever they are, as a cause of the exploited and the oppressed masses in our era.